Kia ora koutou katoa, ko mai Taitoko takuinga no Maniapoto ahau, ki te mana whenua iwi o tēnei rohe kaitahu, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora tātou. I'm going to talk about how we can start to think about and why we think it's important that we build the financial infrastructure now to really ramp up investment into regenerative agriculture. And I'll talk about the venture that we've set up, Calm the Farm, and Toha, the organisation we're building to support ventures like Calm the Farm so that we can scale these kinds of initiatives globally. 3 years ago, Natalie Whitaker, myself and Sean Hendy came together out of our own respective lanes and careers with experiences kind of that got us into the heart of market failure, and we're not proud to say that market failure is one of the key attributes on our CVs, but it is. And what we'd spent our time doing over years was going into areas, identifying some of the hardest to solve areas and using different programs of change, models of change, investment models. How do we kind of make the biggest impact in our communities, on our environment, a whole bunch of things. Natalie built Give a Little and ran that for a number of years. She built a number of other crowdfunding platforms such as Trees That Count and others. Sean Hendy, you may recognise Sean's name. He's been leading the COVID modelling for the Prime Minister for about 1.5 years now. He still is a director of Te Pūnaha Matatenia National Data Science Project, so they do a whole lot of complexity stuff. And I'd been running a number of projects around looking at things like land use, on-farm practices and impacts on fresh water. And the three of us got together with a shared frustration and worry, and that is this, is that how is it that the world is awash with capital, the planet's warming year in, year out, and it doesn't look like it's going to slow down anytime soon. There's these amazing initiatives and projects and programs happening on the ground in our communities and on some of our farms. Yet it's really hard to find how the money is making its way to the front line to these projects in order to help scale them up or replicate them or really get stuck into solving some of our biggest challenges, particularly with regard to climate. And so when we looked at that, we could see, there's a bond market out there right now that's got about $120 trillion in play in the global market. And you've got ESG through the capital markets where trillions of dollars are being tagged to things that are supposedly making a big impact on environmental and social and good governance stuff. But when you dive into any of the annual reports or financials around this stuff to see what difference is that money actually making, it's super hard to see what that difference is. So companies and investors will claim that they spent X amount of millions on this particular thing, but no one will tell you whether or not it's getting more carbon in the ground or slowing down the planet from warming. And so off the back of that kind of bit of initial research we did, the three of us went out and spoke to some investors. We found some awesome Kiwi investors that wanted to back us on this crazy idea that we could build the financial infrastructure that could fund the scaling up of those sorts of initiatives that were going to help us to solve for climate and environmental outcomes. And so we were able to put a team in place, and what we did was we had to look at the spaces that we want to focus on. So we chose 4 spaces: climate, biodiversity, freshwater, and food systems. So kind of big, hairy, audacious spaces. And then we had to work out what that meant. What's the measurement framework? What's the funding platform need to look like? What does impact look like? And so away we went. At the same time, we were just starting to stand this stuff up. I had a small team working alongside Ministry for the Environment, looking at how we could build the tech and innovation and data digital stuff to help us solve some of the impacts that dairy industry was having on fresh water. And through that project, we got to go out and hang out in the kitchens and on the farms with a truckload of dairy farmers. And I grew up, spent a lot of time on my uncle's dairy farm milking cows, and I loved it. It was that time in my life. And so I naively went out thinking, well, this is going to be quite challenging, but I can't wait to get out there. And I wasn't prepared for what we saw when we got out there. And it was the level of anxiety, the pressure, the stress, the depression, the where's the light at the end of the tunnel, and for good reason, increasing compliance costs, the feeling that they're losing the social license to operate, the possibility that agriculture could go into ETS, the high debt across the industry, and it just went on and on and on. So you kind of go away feeling pretty gloomy about all of that. But at the same time, we also got introduced to some other farmers, dairy farmers, who, when we're standing with these guys, it was like we'd fallen through a portal, and we didn't know whether falling through that portal we were in the future or in the past. But what we saw and heard were farmers who had made the transition to this biological farming practices. But the corridor was quite different to the one we'd experienced in the kitchens across a whole lot of dairy farms. And so And remember, this is a separate project, but at the same time as we're trying to get our heads around those four big spaces of climate, freshwater, biodiversity, and food systems. And I took this photo here. I'm standing out in the paddock, listening to these guys. This is about the third visit to the farm, and the lights started going on for me. I stood back and took that photo, and I started to wonder if this business model here was it represented what the future could look like in terms of addressing those four big areas. And so we got to work and dropped our team right into the middle of this, and we've spent about the last 2.5 years turning this thing inside out. So what did we learn? So standing in that paddock with the farmers, often what a lot of them talked about was joy. And I got invited to a science workshop in Wellington, and the scientists in the room were talking about developing an indicator framework for regenerative agriculture. And I stupidly jumped up and I said, joy's an indicator for regenerative agriculture. And I'll never do that again. In fact, I can't do it again because I've never been invited back to the next rounds of workshops. But compared to what we were seeing under a high intensive kind of pressure cooker model, we started to see what it looked like when you lift the lid off the pressure cooker. But what we saw too was when you talk about regenerative agriculture in this country, it sparks a massive range of emotions. And I think there's probably a joy emoji up there. It might be the love heart eyes, I don't know what it is, but there's no doubt it also sparks angry faces and worried faces and happy faces. And when we stood back from all of that, what we actually saw was a long list of farmers, dairy farmers that we'd sat down with or been out of the paddocks with. And they were the ones that with the inquisitive emojis, there was no anger, there was kind of, is this a thing? We need to learn more. Things are changing. What do we do? The real pushback we saw was in between the farmer and the grower of the food and the consumer of the food were a whole bunch of people and organisations who have embedded themselves. And we saw how busy and big that kind of piece in the middle was. And that's a hungry machine that needs feeding. And really at the end of the day, the only two places that food can come from is from the farm and from the consumer. So consequently, you see the farmer being left with not much at the end of the financial year and the consumer paying too much for good food. And so it wasn't surprising that when we stood back and look at it, the pushback's actually coming from the people in the middle. We never met a consumer that would push back on this idea of regen farm agriculture. Very few farmers push back. They want to know about it or they're doing it. And so that served us well for moving this thing forward in terms of getting a better handle on the industry, policymakers, science, a whole bunch of things. And we saw those emoji face emotions kick in when the white paper was launched not so long ago from Our Land and Water and Manaki Whenua, Gwen Grellett, who's a legend in this space, and overwhelmingly had great support. But there was a small group of her colleagues that completely went after the white paper and after her personally. And so we saw the angry faces kick in. But surprisingly, farmers that we knew in our networks and spoke to about it were stoked that finally a pathway had been set out for the research that needs to be done in this space. And the other thing we learned is when you put a photo on social media of a cow eating flowers, humans lose their minds. Guys are like, nice, like. Women are like, oh my God, that's beautiful. Look at it. And their mates are all like, love hearts, love hearts, love hearts. We started to see, if you follow social and Google alerts every day, you've got these things coming from around the world to show us, update us on what's going on globally around Regen Ag. And I can say now that Regen Ag globally is a freight train that's left the station. Every day new wagons are getting hitched to it. It's going fast and not slow, and it ain't going back. This thing's only going in one direction. Humans are starting to connect with nature again. And we saw those Pākehā farmers, third, fourth generation, standing in the paddock, acting more Māori than a lot of Māoris I know, talking to us about understanding the Māori of the whenua and the soil, feeling like they're part of nature again, not apart from nature. And this is real things that real farmers were talking to us about. And so that gave us the confidence to then stand up Calm the Farm. Our investors said, well, if you guys think this is a thing, let's have a look and see if it's real. So we stood up a website called Calm the Farm, and we did one press release, and we got hammered in a really good way. What we were trying to do is say, where's the finance, where could the finance come from to fund this at scale? What do farmers actually need? And we saw that whole market presented itself literally within weeks. We had investors, we had farmers, we had all sorts of people contacting us wanting to know how to get their money in and how to get their money out. And once we could see those stacks on both sides, we could see how we could wire that all together to get the transaction costs down to build this thing. Critical to this whole process was going out and working with a whole bunch of Regen Ag farmers we called our pathfinders. And here's a bunch of them here. So all these guys have been providing us a whole lot of data and information, their financials, their performance over the last 5 years. And if you look at Charlotte and Russell as an example, they were leasing the family land and looking to buy that family land one day. And 3 years ago, they could not make the economics work. Russell was tired, hadn't seen the kids for weeks, and they were just busting their asses basically and couldn't get the thing working. So they had to go to their family and say, we're not going to do this, we're going to find a way out, I've got to work out what we're going to do. In the meantime, we're going to dial the farm back, and until we work out what we're going to do, we're just going to do something a little bit differently. So they contacted a guy called Greg Barclay, worked with Russell and Charlotte. They went from twice a day milking to once a day. That same day, they started the process of getting the diverse pasture species down. They got all the nitrogen off that same day. They started dialing everything back in order to exit. And so that was 3 years ago. And a few months ago, I had dinner with the Prime Minister and some of her ministers. And on my way to that dinner up in Auckland, Russell texted me and he said, just to let you know, Charlotte and I are the proud new owners of our farm. So they'd bought it that day. The reason they were able to do that was because in that 3 years, they took $200,000 out of their feed costs, their vet bills dropped, their production had made its way back to the same level of production after 3 years than what it was when they were milking twice a day. And so they were able to buy the farm. So I told the Prime Minister that story that night, and she said, I want to go and meet Russell and Charlotte. So 2 weeks ago, the Prime Minister went out and we had a session with her and some of her ministers on the farm. Thinking that we could bust through some of those policy barriers to scaling up Regen Ag, we had a go at it, but the message that we had for the Prime Minister was we need to unblock the science barriers and policy barriers to the space. If we don't think about what the future looks like for our farming system, someone else is going to do it for us, we're going to get left behind. So what are we doing with Calm the Farm? Russell and Charlotte, as you can see here, there's a whole bunch of things that are occurring as a consequence of them just carrying out their now business as usual. Their soil health is improving, their pasture health is improving. We know they're growing topsoil and sequestering more carbon. We know their chemical reduction is reduced. We know it's reduced to zero. Animal health and well-being's improved. There's a whole bunch of things. You can see it all there. But the point about that is this, is if you've got the data about some of those improvements, there are investors around the world who want some of that data. They're prepared to invest in that. They want to see the results. So the trick now is say, how do we get that data from Russell and Charlotte, get it out into the investor space, get friendly capital back into them so they can continue to grow their business and fund their transition. And so we've got a couple of key mechanisms inside the Calm the Farm framework. One of them are pledges. So the pledge agreement is between the farmer, Russell and Charlotte, and an investor that says, we're going to hit these milestones over the next 12 months and we're going to provide you the data that shows that we're doing that. That unlocks the finance for these guys. The next mechanism is alongside that, because that pledge agreement has data attached to it, that data then can be used to look at claims for these guys, for the farmers into other markets. Could make it easy for them to do it. So let's take that data, package it up, off to the bank, cheaper interest for any farmer who can provide it through these claims. Offsetters. If they want to see the nitrous oxide reductions because you've gone from 190 kilograms per hectare down to 0 in year 1, you can quantify that and that number is valuable to someone. So we can start to unlock the value for the farmers, not for everybody else in the middle, because they're already doing okay mostly. How do we get that value back for the farmers just because they're carrying out business as usual? Here's an example of just a really simple template. 30 days rotation grazing rates, 0 synthetic nitrogen fertilizers going on, and 100% reduction in chemicals on the farm. Now, there's a whole lot more data behind that, but that's enough for us to start unlocking things with investors. You can't throw money into a sector on top of an already heavily and over-indebted industry without knowing that these guys know what they're doing as they make this transition. So we've got a legendary advisory network now that's come on board. They run their own brands, run their own businesses, but they plug into our pledge building process so that their clients can access some of the benefits that come out the other side of the Calm the Farm process as well. And these guys are absolutely critical to this whole thing working. Sean Hendy leads Toha science team. The scientists have been doing some epic work around building our catalyst frameworks and measurement frameworks. It taps into EU taxonomies around how you fund this stuff and get access to climate bonds and green bonds and all that stuff. And then we need to be able to run simplified authentication, validation processes. And then we need to think about the tech that makes it easier for us to acquire this data. We don't want the farmers doing extra work on this. We just want them to focus on doing what they're good at. One of our colleagues right now is just in the process of bolting a radar under a Air New Zealand Q300. It gives us subsurface soil moisture content every week right across the country. We know regenerative farms are holding more water in the soil underground. We know that. That's a fact. We're about to see it in real time from the sky. It's just tech, right? The tech's the tech. And anyone who says we can crack this because we've got the tech, you kind of want to go, well, yeah, whatever. This is about the humans and how we ask the right questions. It's not about the tech. So having said that, we're building some tech. So we're building tech platform that aligns up with our blended capital stack, that aligns up with the different needs of what the farmers are looking for, our science framework over that to make sure it's all science-backed. We didn't just make this stuff up overnight. It's taken a lot of effort to work out that when we do this, we better know what we're doing and we better do it well because we're going global with this. I'll just finish it here and just acknowledge these guys because they're the heroes. Every farmer, they're the ones who get up earliest in the morning, they go to bed latest at night and probably sleep the least during the night. They've got the most risk capital on the line than anyone in the food system, by far. How is it that they're the ones at the end of the financial year that are often left with the least in their pockets? When we see guys like this who are saying the P&Ls are looking good again and we're finally paying off debt, you kind of go to yourself, how do we get ourselves in the situation where models like this are being largely ignored by our industry? The last thing I want to say is, Papa Tuanuku, our Earth Mother, we're her children, and like all mothers, she loves her children, regardless of how we treat her. And she hasn't given up on us yet, because she loves us, right? But she can't hold on to us forever. The planet's not getting cooler. Agriculture and farming is a way out. And our farmers have to be the heroes that lead the way out. But we got to get out of their way and give them the tools that they need and the finance they need and the support they need to just get on and do it. So that's all I want to leave you guys with.